Okay, welcome back to the FantasyLabs podcast. This is Bryan here with Jay. It's our third week in a row where we're going over different MLB GPPs tournaments on DraftKings and FanDuel. We've done 2 straight weeks of DraftKings. So this week we're going to switch it up to FanDuel. We're going to go over a tournament. We've done a lower stakes and a higher stakes on DraftKings. And we're going to do similar on FanDuel. We'll go over a lower stake this week, and then we'll do a higher stakes, and then we'll kind of see where we're at and if there are any other interesting contests. Maybe do a small slate or something. You guys can always tweet at us or send us a message and let us know what you guys want to listen to and hear about. But this week we're going to go over the big FanDuel tournament that is the $3 one. It's like 50,000 people. The MLB Squeeze is the name of it. And of course I'm joined by my partner in crime here, Jay. What's going on, dude?
Staying out, Bryan. Yeah, excited to talk about the Squeeze, but not as excited as I am for this weekend. We got international basketball. We have preseason football to go along with MLB, so this is definitely one of my favorite weekends we've had in a long time.
And Russell Westbrook staying in Oklahoma City.
Yeah, we're going to see a triple-double every game, so that's exciting. And yeah, I don't know. Are you playing any international basketball this weekend?
I probably will, just because I am crazy.
I'm pretty excited. I want to do a pod on that maybe eventually, but we got King Joff, Jokic, Rudy Fernandez. We got a lot of guys that are in the player pool.
God, I love Joke. Yeah. Oh, man, it's so good. We got Mario. Is he going to play?
I don't know, actually.
I mean, on the roster. I saw
Yeah.
I love Mario.
A lot of guys with similar names that, it's confusing.
I'm just glad that Orlando finally traded Oladipo to get some room for Mario.
It's about time.
Yeah, they're just wasting franchise time, giving minutes to Depot, and Mario's sitting there,
I don't understand it, but we'll save all this banter for the NBA pods. Let's jump into this tournament.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to go over the MLB Squeeze. It looks like it is, it was right at 48,500 people. So right at 50,000. So a pretty good size. It's $3 entry. A little interesting that it's 150 max. So, if it's a bigger slate, you sort of have to definitely pick and choose, like which stacks you're going to pick as usual. It's not like I think on FanDuel it used to be 250 that you could max out a tournament with, and now it's 150. So definitely makes it a more interesting tournament, but pretty solid tournament. $3 and $5K to first place. Definitely an interesting one. I don't know how to segue to this at all.
Yeah, I'll do it. But yeah, I think with this tournament, well, the first interesting thing is that it's a bit of a more flat payout structure, which I'm generally in favor for. But for this one in particular, since you took down first place, I'll go ahead and say it. I'm retroactively not in favor of the payout structure. Yeah, I'm sure you are. But it paid out 25% of the total pool, 140K total prize pool. So for comparison, we're releasing this pod on Friday. The Friday Squeeze is 125K prize pool, which is less, but first place gets 12.5K. I think with 20,000 people cashing. So I know you're kind of the wrong person to ask this question, but what format do you kind of prefer or recommend to people throwing in entries every night here and there? It's easier to cash less of a top prize, or harder to cash but more of that top prize?
I think both are fine. It really is just, and I've talked about this on pods. I think we talked about it with Levitan a bunch. It really just depends on being self-aware of your game. What do you prefer? As a tournament player myself, I much prefer, I don't mind having just really, really bad lineups in hopes that I can take first place. And I was lucky enough to take first place in this one. You're right. I wish it was a little more top heavy on this one night. But I'm not going to complain about that. It was definitely a good night. But yeah, it really just depends on your game. If you are risk adverse, then it definitely makes more sense to go with a more flat structure. Like this, where 25% win and you don't have to be as crazy to get first place. But if you're definitely a risk taker and you don't mind having some really suboptimal lineups with the chance that you could take down first place, then I think it definitely makes sense to go with those more top heavy. So it really just depends on yourself. I'm more in the latter group in the top heavy lineups, but I can understand arguments for both.
Right. Yeah, I'm kind of more in the middle of the two. I like a deep payout structure, but you also got to kind of make it worth it at the top. And this one was kind of like 25% is a lot of the pool. But we have tournaments of every size every night. So you just kind of play the ones you want and the ones, like you said, that fit your skill set.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so many options, that you can really just pick and choose which one you want to do. Okay, so let's dive into this tournament, Jay. So interesting. It was the lineup that won, which I just feel like such a dick, like saying this.
It's your lineup, man.
Yeah. We had said that we were going to do the squeeze before I took it down. So I promise this wasn't.
Yeah, you came through. Through.
So I'll try not to just sound like a total douche on this. But so the lineup that won was a Washington Minnesota stack. It was a 4 for like a 2-team 4-man stack for each team, which is interesting because we had talked about the fact that we both like stacking 2 teams and going 4-4 or 5-3 on DraftKings, or you can go 4-4 on DraftKings as well. And we talked about the reason that we liked it is because it actually minimizes your risk a little bit. Because if you go 4-4, really you just have to have 2 teams go off, and then just like if you pick those right guys and you put yourself in a situation where then your pitcher goes off too, then all of a sudden you're in a really good spot. Whereas if you go 3-3, you go 4-2, or whatever other combination where you have players outside of your stack, or just maybe a 4-man stack with 4 additional people instead of stacking 2 teams, then you have to hit perfectly on every position, which isn't that it's not that likely. I guess it's not super likely that you're going to hit perfectly on the 2-team stack, but it is like when it does happen, it's going to vault you up the leaderboard. And that's what happened on this night. Minnesota scored 12 runs and Washington scored 14 runs. So
not too shabby.
Yeah. So, stacking those 2 teams together, obviously, like put all those players in, really advantageous situations. And so I had the 4-man stack of Washington. It was Wilson Ramos, Daniel Murphy, Trey Turner, and Bryce Harper. And then the Minnesota stack was Joe Mauer, Jorge Polanco, Eddie Rosario, and then the GOAT, Max Kepler with the triple dong. Just crazy. I thought what it was interesting, and I was talking to you throughout this night because right away I was I liked the upside of this lineup because Kepler just his first 3 at bats just crushed it. So I knew that this lineup, especially since I had it paired with a high implied team like Washington. So again, this is something that we had talked about where you can get chalky. And I had guys that were pretty chalky. Bryce Harper was 23% owned, but you pair them with the fact that it's your whole lineup is what makes it unique lineup, not just 1 or 2 guys. So I was able to get the chalky high implied total of the Washington game and pair it with the Minnesota game and get it that unique lineup. So when Minnesota went off, and the fact that I still had that Washington stack still to go, I was talking about how I like the odds. But then Duffy had like 1 million strikeouts, and I didn't have him. I had Kyle Hendricks as my pitcher who hadn't gone yet. So I was very worried. I was talking to you off or just in our chat that I was liking the upside of it, but I didn't think that I was going to be anywhere near the top because Duffy ended up just crushing,
Yeah, Duffy was definitely a tough fade. That just makes your lineup that much better that you won this thing without Duffy when he had just an insane game. So, it ended up being like that. I think second place had Duffy, and actually second place had a very similar team in that they did stack 4 Twins and I think 3 Nationals, or vice versa. But it was very right, Jankowski. Yeah, so it was very similar, but you had mixed players, and like you said, these teams scored 26 runs combined. So everybody's going to be in a pretty good spot. Obviously, both of you needed to have Kepler, of course. But, I mean, the rest, there were a lot of guys that went off. I mean, he got second place, and he had Dozier, who got, I think, 3 points still. So I think – and then, like you said, that's kind of the theme of this pod, is that you had a stack of a team that had a low implied run total, and you combined it with a team that had a high implied run total. So you kind of hedge yourself, and that's your contrarian chalk combination that really hits a lot. And these 4x4 stacks, 2 teams are just huge, and they're so successful over time. They're so overlooked as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And something that we had discussed a lot, and something that we both agree that we liked, is stacking a team, but not doing it just in just the regular way. It's very easy just to say, okay, I'm just going to stack 4 players, and I can go into an optimizer on whatever site I use, if you use FantasyLabs or whatever site, and just lock in the top 4 guys. I mean, usually those are the most optimal guys to lock in. Theoretically, those should be 4 of the best batters on the team. And then also they are going to get the most opportunities. The guys at the top of the order get the most at-bats. Just that's the way that baseball works. And so it's just easy, and it's going to have a lot of lineup overlap when you just lock in the top 4 players. So we had talked about a way to be contrarian is to find inefficiencies in lineups and to find guys with high upside in the lower order, or just mixing up your stack a little bit. And so this Minnesota stack was not only really low owned because they were going against Salazar, who was sort of the chalk pitcher of the slate, and they were a low implied team, but also I elected to go with a sort of different stacker with Mauer Kepler, which was the 2-3, and then I jumped to Rosario Polanco. So I still had some correlation there. It was sort of 2-2. It wasn't like I just picked a 1, 4, 7, 9 or something where like the batters weren't next to each other. But these were guys that had some upside for sure. Mauer Kepler, we know, he's almost got like a 300 ISO. And then I also like Rosario and Polanco are guys who are hitting in the bottom of the order, but also have like a 200 ISO against righties. So these were guys that were sort of undervalued when you look at their splits. They probably should have been hitting higher in the order. So you can, sort of find those inefficiencies in your lineups and spread out your stack and be more unique. That's something I definitely love to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with those various ways to kind of get contrarian within one lineup. And I think even on a broader level, there's some very interesting observations with your lineup and kind of the slate overall. We didn't have a single team projected at over 5 runs on the slate. It was an 8-game slate. So I think you just had no sizable margin between the top team and the bottom team. So it gave you even more reason to stack some of these low teams. So you had the Twins, who were projected to score the least amount of runs on the slate. So you can kind of predict that they're going to have the lowest ownership out of any team, kind of hinging on the basis that Vegas data is pretty tightly correlated with stacking ownership. So I thought that was really interesting that you went and stacked the lowest owned team, the lowest implied team. And then what made it even more interesting was that it was the team, against the Indians, who were implied to score the most runs on the slate. So not only were you fading the team that everybody was on, you were taking the opposite team that nobody would likely be on unless they stack that game. So that was something that was very interesting that stood out for me. Yeah,
and that's not something that's going to hit very often, but that's the point of a GPP. And maybe that's more of a thing to do in a top heavy tournament. We're going to have NFL come up just a couple weeks here where you're going to have crazy top heavy tournaments with hundreds of thousands of people in a Millie Maker, and that's the point. Is it's was this if you're just talking about was the probability of this lineup hitting, if you simulated this day a million times, probably not very high. I'll admit that. But that's the point of GPP is it doesn't have to be high. You're trying to, as Bales has sort of popularized in DFS, you try to create an anti-fragile lineup. The goal is not to create the most optimal lineup. It is when crazy thing happens. When the Twins score 12 runs, when something crazy happens, have you put yourself in a position to reap the benefits? So you're right. It wasn't probably an optimal decision. It definitely wasn't an optimal decision to stack the Twins. But in the case that they did go off against Salazar, who was the chalky guy, you can create a lineup to benefit from that craziness, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think actively, it's a good strategy. Actively stacking against the team that was likely going to score the most runs with the team that's likely not going to score. It's like going on vacation to Nebraska over Clearwater Beach, and then you find yourself eating the best steak of your life, and the beach gets wiped out by a tsunami or something. And that's not likely going to happen every time, but when it does, it's a bold contrarian strategy that pays off when it hits. And that's exactly kind of what happened here.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting is like people just play the same way in each slate, like every day. Like they don't treat the slate any differently very often. So, if you have like a guy that's really chalky, he's just like the class of that slate, he's going to have, 25%, 30% ownership, regardless of who it is. So that guy could be Danny Salazar, that guy could be Clayton Kershaw, that guy could be Jake Arrieta. Like all these guys are good pitchers, obviously, but like it's very slate dependent. So like, Clayton Kershaw and Danny Salazar could both respectively be the chalk of their slates, but like you should approach that differently. Like if a bad pitcher, even if he is the class of the slate, if that's the case, like you should just approach it differently. Like there's no way that guy should be 30% owned. And not saying that Danny Salazar wasn't, isn't a good pitcher or anything. I think he's a very talented guy. But you know what? There was some warning signs. Like he had got beat up a little bit in the past couple starts. He was allowing like a 40% hard hit rate. So it wasn't like he was a guy in great recent form in this just crazy shutdown ace. There was some warning signs that potentially he wasn't as good as, everyone was thinking he was going to be going against the Twins. And the Twins themselves had just come off, a hot game as well. I mean, at this point, they've scored like 1 million runs in the last week.
At least. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, going back to kind of that strategy, and a perfect example of this as well happened the next night, Tuesday night, with the Super Monster on FanDuel, where first place got 100K, and Chipotle Addict took it down, who's really good. Yeah. Well, I'm definitely waiting. I know in the shadows, Qdoba Addict is waiting to take it. But Chipotle Addict took down the Super Monster not only with a 4x4 stack, just like you did, but he used a Philly stack against Madison Bumgarner, who is the easy shot of the slate. And it's the same thing. Those guys were virtually not owned at all, and he had the Philly stack that just went off. So he put himself in a great position, and then he paired it, just like you did, with the Tiger stack of that night, who was the national stack of your night. They were implied to score the second amount of most runs that night. They were pretty chalky. They were high owned, but he went chalk there, and he went very contrarian with his other team, which was the Phillies. And it was a simple 4x4 stack, 6 figures. Obviously, I'm sure you wish you traded places in your night, obviously that. But, it's the same principle. And you look back-to-back nights. It's just a strategy that I think people kind of write off on the surface or say, oh, well, everybody's going to do that. It's just so easy. I mean, you look at the lineups, you're like, wow, I could have made that in 3 seconds. You just look 4 players, and boom, that's it. But I don't think it's a practical measure that a lot of people put into place.
Yeah, and you're right. Like, you can do that. And, like, we encourage you. Like, that's, something we've been in our 10 ways, we said that we like this, and we've said in our last couple pods that we like this strategy. It is harder than just, you can just say on Twitter to do. Like the fact that, like, you're having, like, a 15-game slate, and you can only have 150 max lineups. Like, it's just not possible to, like, sort of pair every team in a perfect, like, just 2-team stack in a way that's optimal and get the pitchers you want in. It's just sort of not possible to do that with the amount of lineups that you're allowed to put in. And, I don't know if that's an optimal way to use your bankroll anyway. It's definitely harder, but, like, you can pick your spots, like, there was reason to believe that Salazar was struggling a little bit. I'm not sure. I would have to look at the Bumgarner call, but it's again, it's that anti-fragile mindset. This isn't probable, but if something happens, like, can I put myself in a position to make 100K? Like,
right.
Like, is it probable? No, but, like, I could make 100K if I'm willing to, spend, the money on this entry fee and lose it. And, like, I've done this strategy many a slate before where I've stacked a low implied team with a high implied team, and I've lost my $3 in the squeeze. But, there's other nights where they score 12 runs and, it hits. So that's just sort of the nature of being a GPP player is you take your lumps and then hopefully, you hit the big one and it makes up for it.
Yeah, and this translates to all sports as well. You can break it down the same way. It's sports. I mean, especially baseball, they just have such high variance. Teams can go against Vegas. Vegas isn't right every single game. So you look at that data more in tournaments, I think, to kind of predict ownership. And you go against Vegas, knowing that the public will go with Vegas. And that's where you kind of make up the ground in these large tournaments. And real quick, if you want to, we kind of covered the hitting and the stacks, 4x4 strategy, and things like that. How did you kind of select your pitcher on this slate in particular? I know we had the chalk with Salazar. Obviously, you weren't going to go him when you focused on a twin stack. But Strasburg was out there. I think he was the highest owned, around 20%. Archer was a good play, 18.5%. Hendricks was obviously a good play too. How did you kind of pick your pitching on this slate? Because that's another pretty crucial thing when you make these stacks is who are you going to go at pitching?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I actually liked Hendricks as my favorite pitcher on FanDuel. Obviously, Strauss was a great play. Like pulling up his stats, yeah, he had a K prediction of like 10 strikeouts, and he was a huge. It was a -206 favorite at close. So obviously a great spot. I didn't go him in particular just because I wanted to get those 4 bats, and you can't have 4 Washington bats and also take their pitcher. So it was off Strauss for me, and he was a little overpriced.
Right.
I wasn't in love with Salazar for the reasons, I just didn't think he was in great recent form. Hendricks, I thought he was in good form. He had allowed an exit velocity of 89 miles an hour, a hard hit rate of around 25%. So this was a guy who's coming in to the game in good recent form. He was facing the Marlins, not a great projected WOBA team or anything. It wasn't like he had a great K prediction, but on FanDuel, it's still important for strikeouts, but he was a heavy favorite and a guy who was relatively cheap, especially compared to the Salazar and Strasburg. So I really liked his spot, and in general, that's sort of what I do in tournaments, especially on FanDuel for pitching. Is I just want my base. I just want a guy who's not going to crush me. Sort of I'm more willing to take optimal value plays for pitching and just get my base of where I want, and then if my bats hit, and that's where I can really go. And that's sort of the fact that Danny Duffy outscored Hendricks by 30 points.
Yeah.
And and this lineup still won just shows you that Kepler in his 63 points just sort of completely outdid that by himself. So with pitching, I'm more willing to go optimal and take sort of a chalky guy. So I would say that Hendricks wasn't as chalky as Strasburg or Salazar, but it wasn't like I went super off the radar here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the percentages surprised me in this tournament. I remember being pretty surprised, not with Strasburg and even Salazar, but Hendricks was only 7% in this tournament. And then Duffy, who actually had good numbers, was only 5%. He was in Tampa Bay, great park factor rating, obviously. Right. Raising the 3rd highest K percentage in all of baseball. I mean, he wasn't in a bad spot by any means, and just nobody was on him. So I think there are instances, it's really hard to get 84 points out of your pitcher, but there are instances that arise where you kind of see the chalk. Strasburg, you could argue, was overpriced. Salazar had, like you said, I mean, he ended up on the DL. There were negative signs that he wasn't healthy. He wasn't perfect in all his pitching mechanics and whatnot. So you could fade those top 2 guys, and you get further down the line and kind of get some of those guys who still have upside that people are going to be off of.
Yeah, I wasn't super surprised about Duffy. He had just come off a game where he wasn't that amazing against the Angels, and he was actually a dog in this game, which is just a pretty huge deal on FanDuel. A lot of people really, really go after that 12-point FanDuel win bonus. So a lot of people just sort of write off dogs in general, which is a pretty good contrarian strategy in its own right. Especially it's a sort of a FanDuel centric one. But a guy with high upside, he had an 8.3 K prediction, which was just behind Strasburg. So a guy, obviously, and he had a million strikeouts, going against Tampa Bay in a good pitcher's park. But a guy who, people are going to be off because he's not a favorite is sort of an interesting way to be contrarian. So I didn't have Duffy in that winning lineup, but I think he's definitely worth mentioning because he was a great contrarian play because of the underdog status for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's something, especially in baseball, you can kind of, well, every sport really, just with the nature of sports and whatnot, you can capitalize on the low ownership of guys who might be underdogs by minimal amounts. The money line is plus 135 or something, and that's not that big of a margin. I mean, you can still take those guys if everything else is right, like the park factor, the K upside facing that team, and so on and so forth. So I think, yeah, it's a great strategy. Obviously, it worked out big time with Duffy. Doesn't work out with some guys, but overall, you're trying to get first place. You kind of need those to hit every now and then.
Yeah, exactly. One thing I want to talk about quickly before we end this pod, Jay, is something we talked about just a little bit off air. Is the idea, and this is something that we didn't mention in our 10 Ways to be Contrarian in our original pod for this series, and I sort of regret that we didn't, but I think it's a really interesting way to be contrarian, is to leave salary on the table. And this is sort of brought up because of the two-team stack, going 4-4, where you're using all of your batters in just two teams. You don't have any additional spots. And so really the idea is, if you're going to stack a low implied team, they're often going to have low salaries. So your option, if you're going to, stack two teams, so you're sort of foregoing the higher priced options in your lineup to get the correlations of the teams. So that means either you can, pay up for pitching and potentially pay up for a guy that you don't necessarily think is as good or like as much, or you can just leave, whatever amount of salary on the table as you should, really, to get the pitching and the bats that you want. But that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. What are your thoughts on leaving salary on the table?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most underutilized strategies one can have in tournaments. And you just really have to break it down. Like, if you're taking a team or you're a running back or two running backs or whatever sport you want to talk about, NBA, a cheap team, and you leave a lot of salary on the table and you stack that team, for example, in baseball, other people are going to stack that team too. And it kind of pits you in a circumstance that's similar with the other person, where you guys both, it limits your options. You have that much salary left, like you said, for a pitcher. You're probably going to spend up. You can afford any pitcher you want. So can the other guy. So you're both kind of along the same lines of thinking, hey, we have this low-owned stack. Here's the players we can spend up on. And that's what you do. That's what most people do. But the contrarian way is to say, okay, I like this pitcher who's 2K less than that 10K pitcher. I still want him, and I'm going to leave 2K on the table. And I think that's what you have to do, especially on smaller slates, and especially in NFL. Some of those like the primetime slates, I mean, that's huge for leaving salary on the table. So it's something a lot of people are kind of scared of doing. The public, they always want to spend up. When you have a limited player pool and you want to allocate all of your salary, then it limits it even more.
Yeah, and honestly, I do this very often, especially in a smaller slate. Like we were talking about in the early slate today, like I'll leave, 1,500, 2K on the table. And it's really just what you value. Like in NFL or in MLB or really whatever sport, if you value optimizing your lineup, then like, you're right, you should pay up in order to get closer to the salary cap, whatever that means, whether you should, go at 3-4 stack and then pay up for an expensive outfielder, or, whether you should, pay up for that pitcher, or whether you should pay up for a wide receiver, whatever. But the reason that I like to do it is because I value the correlation that I'm getting more than I value the salary that I'm missing. So I'm willing to forego the salary because I'm getting the correlation of the 4 guys on one team and 4 guys on the other team. And I'm not willing to and so it's almost like by spending up in salary, I'm optimizing my lineup, but I'm decreasing the odds of winning the tournament because of the correlations. And if that is a contrarian mindset, then that's sort of just a bonus for me. But I think it's actually the superior tournament strategy just for hitting on a lineup without even factoring in the fact that you're going to have a more unique lineup. So it's sort of just a win-win for me.
Yeah, it's tough because you kind of have it ingrained in your mind that you want to capitalize on pricing inefficiencies, and that's more of kind of a standard for cash games, although you can still leave money on the table. I do it a lot in NBA when value plays, especially in NBA, backups pop up, and you just don't need to spend all your salary. But for MLB, I think it's different for cash games and tournaments, and this is really a tournament strategy overall where it's okay to leave a lot of salary on the table. in the long run, it just helps you get more contrarian over time.
Yeah, I completely agree. I love the strategy in general, and especially in small slates. Yeah, I mean, it's if you're worried about spinning up on and getting close to that salary cap, then you're just going to forego a lot of opportunity to have correlations that could possibly win a tournament.
Right,
so,
like you did.
Yeah, of course. So that's I guess our secret 11th way to be a contrarian.
Yeah, the ultimate secret. But yeah, I mean, we got, the same tournament is every night on FanDuel that we just broke down. I know one thing, tournaments are really tricky. A lot of people go into them kind of expecting to cash them regularly or win one like a week or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you lose 4 days in a row, you're doing something really wrong, especially for some new players. But really, you kind of look at some of the best tournament players in the industry. They can easily go on really long dry spells. Just similar to Jose Abreu, before he went yard tonight, I think it was like 32 games or something. So I think that's something to take into account on top of all these strategies, and it can really mess with your head on like, is my process correct? I've lost 6 nights in a row in a 45,000 person tournament.
Right.
But you just got to really focus on that sound process, kind of attack all the highlights we just went through on this pod for this tournament, and make your own contrarian process and strategy. It'll pay off on the long run.
Yeah, and it's definitely a good thought. Like if you're losing, you could get frustrated and say, "Is my process the wrong one?" And the answer might be yes. You might have a process fixed, but just because you're losing does not mean that your process is wrong. We always focus on having a process-oriented approach instead of results-oriented approach. I know that's sort of cliche at this point, but it's something we believe in. Like, we would not be doing this podcast and doing this this series for 5 weeks or however long it may end up being if we didn't believe in a process of building these tournaments over the long run and how that'll be profitable. So we definitely encourage you guys to stay the course and to work on your process and not get frustrated if you don't win 50,000 person tournament, for sure.
Yeah, and there are other things that go into it, like your bankroll. Obviously, I don't want you to just bleed cash every night. You got to kind of play within your means and understand that it might take some time for you to win your first tournament or win a big prize. So you kind of have to anticipate that it's difficult to do and not just kind of throw in $100 in your account, make 5 27 or 3 $27 teams or whatever the case is, and just kind of blow your cash real quick. And that's not the most efficient way to do it. You kind of have to play within your bankroll a bit, especially in tournaments. Yeah,
and there's no shame in moving down, a buy-in level. Like, I always encourage people, if you're going to have $50 to spend, find a tournament that's $1 and spend 50 lineups on $1 and sort of differentiate yourself and allow yourself to be risky and learn your process of risk tolerance and how to create contrarian lineups, as opposed to just throw all of your money in on just one $50 lineup that has a bigger cash, but it's going to be uncomfortable if it's your first time doing this or you're new to creating contrarian lineups. It's very hard when you're throwing all that money into one lineup to be contrarian. You just sort of feel that you should be optimal because you want to just at least make your money back in cash, but that's not really the mindset that you should have in a tournament. You have to be willing to lose it. And I feel like if you move down in buy-in levels and you just sort of differentiate your action a little bit across your lineups, then you're more willing to be a little less optimal and therefore probably maximize your odds of actually taking down the tournament.
Yeah, I agree with everything. I mean, diversification is your friend in these tournaments. So the more entries at these lower stakes is better than one entry at stakes you probably shouldn't be playing.
Cool. Any more thoughts to you guys? We get into there.
Yeah, I think I'm good. Just good luck if you guys want to play the squeeze, the Friday one, or any one really. And also good luck to all you fellow degens who are playing football this weekend and basketball in August, like myself. So good luck in that as well.
In Olympic golf, yeah, it's all happening.
Yeah, we got a lot going on. It's like the power weekend. It's awesome.
That's right, yeah. Exciting stuff. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back next week. We'll do a higher stakes FanDuel tournament and break that down. Maybe this is your time, Jay. You got to win this one.
All right, yeah. I'll win the one that pays out a good chunk.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, thanks everyone for listening. Talk to you guys next week.
Good luck, guys.